"You'll live here forever, Mom. It's just paperwork," he said. Now the bank is trying to evict me. The letter that ended my life as I knew it did not arrive with a thunderclap. It came on a Tuesday morning tucked between a grocery store flyer and a postcard from a friend. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, heavy with a kind of importance that made my hands feel cold. The return address was a law firm I didn't recognize. I stood in my sunny kitchen, the one my husband and I had painted this cheerful shade of yellow 30 years ago, and I opened it. There were many words, all of them formal and cold, but my eyes found only 3: notice of foreclosure. The linoleum floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Foreclosure. The word was an obscenity in this house, a place I had owned free and clear for 2 decades. My home, my fortress, the one great asset I had built over a lifetime of teaching and saving, was being taken from me. And the most shocking part was not that it was happening, but that my own son was the one who had handed the bank the keys. It had all started a year ago with a promise. A promise whispered over my kitchen table by my only son, Frank. He had come to me, his face etched with a worry I had never seen before. He was a salesman, and he had the language of one smooth, confident, reassuring. He told me he was on the verge of a huge business deal, but that he and his wife, Brenda, were in a temporary financial bind. Then he had looked at me, his eyes full of earnest desperation, and he had pitched me the deal of a lifetime. A reverse mortgage. "It's brilliant, Mom," he'd said, spreading the glossy brochures on the table. "The house is just sitting on all this money, your equity. This way you can access a portion of it. You give it to me to invest, I'll get a huge return, and we'll pay it all back in a year. Nothing changes for you. You get to live here forever, rent-free. It's a win-win." He made it sound so simple, so safe. He made it sound like my love for him had a convenient cash-out option. It's a terrifying thing to place your entire life security in the hands of someone you love. As I share the story of that signature, I find myself wondering where you are in the world listening to this. It would bring me some small comfort to know where my story has landed. If you have a moment, please leave a comment to let me know where you're from, and consider subscribing to Granny Stories to hear the rest of my cautionary tale. I had questions, of course, but he had an answer for everything. He brushed off the fine print as legal jargon. He dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. "This is about our family's future, Mom," he'd said, and that was the line that had broken me. I, a retired school teacher who could barely make sense of a new cell phone contract, had looked into the eyes of my son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged and whose homework I had checked, and I had trusted him. I sat at my own kitchen table, and I signed the stack of papers he put in front of me. I signed away the financial soul of my home. For a year, the illusion was perfect. Frank and Brenda's lives blossomed. There was a new car, a trip to Hawaii, expensive dinners they posted about on social media. Frank told me the investment was doing wonderfully, and I, living in my own home, sleeping in my own bed, felt a quiet pride that my sacrifice had built their success. The house felt the same. I believed I was safe. And then, yesterday morning, the letter came. And I learned that my fortress had been hollowed out from the inside, and I was now just a tenant living on borrowed time in the ruins of my own life. I must have sat at that kitchen table for an hour, the foreclosure notice clutched in my hand, my mind a storm of disbelief. I read the cold legal phrases over and over, hoping that my old eyes had deceived me, that I had misunderstood. Failure to pay property taxes and homeowners insurance, default on loan terms, commencement of foreclosure proceedings. These were words for other people's lives, for stories you see on the evening news. They were not words that belonged in my quiet, well-ordered home. The house I had paid off in 1998. The house that was supposed to be my fortress against the uncertainties of old age. My first instinct, the instinct of a mother that has been ingrained in me for 50 years, was to believe there had been a terrible mistake. I reached for the phone, my fingers trembling so badly I had to dial my son's number twice. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice breezy and confident. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" I couldn't match his casual tone. My own voice came out as a strained whisper. "Frank," I said, "I got a letter. From the mortgage company. It says the house is in foreclosure." The silence on the other end of the line was the only confession I needed. It was a silence so heavy, so full of guilt, that it felt like a physical weight. At first, he tried to deny it. He called it a clerical error, a mix-up at the bank, something he would sort out immediately. But I pressed him. I read him the account numbers, the default dates, the cold, hard facts from the paper in my hand. And then his facade crumbled. The confident voice of the salesman was replaced by the choked, ragged sound of a boy caught in a lie. He began to weep. Not the dignified tears of a man admitting fault, but the desperate, gulping sobs of a child terrified of the consequences. And through those sobs, the whole ugly truth came spilling out. There had been no investment. There were no booming returns. The money was simply gone. It had paid off his secret credit card debts. It had paid for the down payment on Brenda's new luxury car. It had paid for their vacation to Hawaii, the one they told me was a bonus from his work. He admitted that he was supposed to use a portion of the funds to pay the property taxes and insurance as the loan required, but the money had run out months ago. He said he had been too ashamed, too terrified to tell me. He kept repeating that he was going to fix it, that he would get the money somehow. But his promises were like ghosts, thin and without substance. The money was gone. The house was in the hands of the bank. And the son I had trusted with my entire life's security was nothing but a frightened, weeping voice on the other end of the telephone. I hung up. I did not say goodbye. There were no words left. The woman who had picked up the phone believing in a mistake was gone. In her place was a woman who now understood the full, devastating scope of the betrayal. I walked through my home, my fortress, and all I could see were the ghosts of a life that was no longer mine. I touched the worn spot on the arm of my late husband's reading chair. I looked at the pencil marks on the door frame, measuring our son's height through the years. Each memory was now tainted a scene from a past I no longer recognized. I was a stranger in my own history. I could have surrendered then. I could have let the despair, so vast and so absolute, swallow me whole. I could have packed my bags and waited for the bank to tell me when to leave. But as I stood in the living room, surrounded by the quiet, accusing evidence of a life well lived, my eyes fell on a photograph on the mantelpiece. It was of me 20 years ago, standing in front of my first grade classroom. I looked so young, so formidable, so full of a quiet, unshakable belief in the order of things. The belief that problems could be solved, that lessons could be taught, that a life could be managed with care and integrity. My son could not save me from this. I would have to save myself. The morning after my son's confession was a landscape of gray. The despair was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that made it difficult to breathe, to move. I sat at my kitchen table, the foreclosure notice lying beside my untouched cup of tea, like a death sentence. Every corner of my house, once a source of comfort, now seemed to mock me with memories of a life that had been built on a lie. The shame was the worst part. The shame of being a fool, of being a 76-year-old retired teacher who had been so easily duped by her own son. How could I have been so blind? I spent the morning adrift in that fog of regret. But the woman who had stood in front of a classroom for 40 years, the woman who believed in order and in finding solutions, had not entirely vanished. Sometime around noon, a memory surfaced through the haze. A small, forgotten flyer I had picked up at the public library months ago for a nonprofit organization called Senior Legal Advocates. At the time, I had taken it out of a vague sense of civic duty, never imagining I would be the one in need. It took me another hour to find the courage to overcome the deep, ingrained pride that insisted I should handle my own sorrows in private. But this was no longer a sorrow. It was a crisis. With a trembling hand, I found the flyer and dialed the number. The voice on the other end was kind and professional. I explained in a voice I barely recognized as my own that I was facing a foreclosure due to what I believed was financial deception. She didn't ask probing questions. She simply said, "Can you come in tomorrow at 10? The bus ride to their downtown office the next morning felt like a journey to another country. I left my quiet tree-lined street and traveled into the heart of the city, a place of noise and concrete, and 1,000 strangers each with their own urgent private battles. The office was in a modest, older building, the waiting room filled with people who looked like me, their faces etched with worry, their hands clutching thick folders of paperwork. I was not alone in my predicament, and that small, sad fact brought me a sliver of comfort. The woman who called my name was not who I expected. She was a young, sharp, energetic woman in her late 20s. Her name was Anita. She led me to a small, cluttered office and looked at me with eyes that were not full of pity, but of a fierce, focused intelligence. I was ashamed to tell my story. I felt my voice falter as I explained the reverse mortgage, the investment, the lies. I pushed the foreclosure notice and the papers I had signed across the desk to her. She read them in silence, her expression growing more intense with each page. When she finally looked up, her eyes were hard. "Mrs. Coleman," she said, and her voice was firm. "What your son did is not just a mistake or a bad decision. There's a legal term for it. It's called financial elder abuse." Hearing those words, hearing my private shame given a formal legal name, was like a sudden bracing slap of cold water. The burden of foolishness, the weight of the blame I had placed squarely on my own shoulders began to shift. It was not just that I had been too trusting. It was that he had been deliberately, cruelly deceitful. Anita explained that our situation was dire, but not hopeless. The contract I had signed was legal, but the way I had been persuaded to sign it, the lies, the misrepresentation of it as a no-risk investment, gave us a legal basis to fight. We couldn't make the debt disappear, but we could fight for a just settlement. We could hold him accountable. I walked out of that crowded downtown office into the harsh afternoon sunlight. The foreclosure notice was still in my purse, a heavy, terrifying truth. But beside it now was something new, Anita's business card. It was just a small piece of cardboard with a name and a number, but it felt heavier, more substantial than the foreclosure notice. It was not a promise of an easy victory. It was something far more important. It was the promise of a fight. And for the first time since opening that terrible letter, I felt the strength in my own 2 feet again. My meeting with Anita left me with a new, unfamiliar kind of energy. It was the energy of a plan. The despair that had clouded my mind for days began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. Anita had given me homework. She had asked me to write down everything, not just the facts of the reverse mortgage, but the entire history of my financial relationship with my son. For a retired teacher, it was a familiar task research document present the facts. But this was the most painful research paper I had ever been assigned. I spent the next 3 days at my kitchen table surrounded by old checkbook registers, bank statements, and the quiet ghosts of my own generosity. I unearthed a decade of help. The $5,000 to cover Brenda's car repair that was never paid back. The countless checks for groceries that I now suspected had paid for their expensive dinners out. Each entry in my neat teacher's handwriting was a small testament to my own blindness. I was not just writing down numbers. I was chronicling a long and quiet betrayal. The process was agonizing, but it was also clarifying. I was not a foolish, sentimental old woman. I was a victim of a calculated long-term deception. As I worked, Frank began to call. His tone had shifted. The weeping, apologetic boy was gone, replaced by a man whose fear was beginning to curdle into resentment. He no longer promised to fix it. Instead, he started asking questions laced with blame. "Why are you making this so difficult, Mom? Can't we just handle this as a family? Bringing lawyers into this is just going to make everything worse for everyone." He was trying to pull me back into the familiar dynamic of guilt and obligation, but the woman he was speaking to was no longer there. I learned to say a new, powerful sentence. "You'll have to speak with my legal representative, Frank. Her name is Anita." The first time I said it, he was stunned into silence. The second time, he grew angry. By the third call, he simply hung up. The old lines of communication, the ones where he pleaded and I yielded, were now closed. At the end of the week, I sent my completed chronicle to Anita. It was a 20-page document, a meticulous and heartbreaking audit of my own love. Anita called me the moment she received it. "This is everything we need." "Margaret," she said, her voice full of a new energy, "this isn't just a case of being misled. This is a clear pattern of financial exploitation." The first official letter from her office was sent the next day. It was not addressed to my son. It was addressed to the mortgage company with Frank Carbon copied. It was a formal notice of intent to enter into legal mediation, citing fraudulent inducement and a clear case of financial elder abuse. Sending that letter felt like firing a cannon into the quiet, still waters of my life. There was no going back. While I waited for their response, I took my own small, practical steps. I went to my bank, and with the help of a patient young teller, I changed all my passwords and added new security questions, questions Frank would never know the answers to. I was methodically building a financial firewall around the small territory I had left. The battle was no longer being fought in my kitchen or in my heart. It was now being fought with certified mail and legal letterhead, and for the first time in a very long time, I had a strange, unfamiliar feeling I thought I might actually win. The response to our legal letter did not come from my son. It came, as Anita had predicted, from the mortgage company. It was a crisp, formal letter from their legal department acknowledging our complaint and agreeing to a mediation session. They did not admit fault, of course. Corporations never do. But their willingness to meet was in itself a victory. It meant they saw the threat. They knew that a public lawsuit involving the words financial elder abuse was a stain they did not want on their polished reputation. Frank's response came a day later, not to me, but in a furious, rambling voicemail to Anita. She called to summarize it for me. He had accused me of being senile, of being manipulated by a shady pro bono lawyer. He had threatened to countersue for defamation. He had painted himself as the dutiful son and me as the ungrateful, confused mother who was trying to ruin his life. It was a portrait of a cornered man lashing out with the only weapons he had left: blame and bluster. But at the end of all the noise, he had no choice. He agreed to attend the mediation. He was legally bound to the mess he had created. The day of the mediation was gray and overcast, the sky the color of a bruise. Anita picked me up. I wore a simple dark blue dress, the kind I used to wear to parent-teacher conferences. I wanted to look like what I was: a reasonable, serious woman who had been grievously wronged. The mediation took place in a soulless conference room in a downtown office building. The table was long and polished, reflecting the cold fluorescent lights above. I sat with Anita on one side. On the other side sat Frank, my son, looking pale and thinner than I had ever seen him. Beside him sat Brenda, his wife, her face a mask of controlled fury. They would not look at me. The lawyers did most of the talking. It was a cold, passionless discussion of statutes, of loan terms, of fiduciary responsibility. I listened as Anita calmly and methodically laid out our case, presenting the documents from my 20-page chronicle of financial support, highlighting the deceptive language Frank had used to sell me the investment. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. Then the mediator, a calm, patient woman, turned to me. "Mrs. Coleman," she asked gently, "is there anything you would like to say?" I looked across the table, past the lawyers, past the water glasses, and I looked at my son. "I signed those papers, Frank." I said, my voice quiet but clear. "I signed them because you were my son, and I trusted you. I gave you my life savings not as an investment, but as an act of love. You took that love and you took that trust, and you used it to buy a new car and a trip to Hawaii while neglecting the very roof over my head. I am not here for revenge. I am here for a correction." I saw something flicker in Frank's eyes then. Not remorse, not yet. But for the first time, I think he saw the true cost of what he had done, measured not in dollars, but in the loss of something far more valuable. The offer came an hour later from the mortgage company's lawyer. It wasn't a perfect victory. They could not simply make the loan disappear, but it was a lifeline. They proposed a settlement. Frank would be forced to liquidate his own assets, the new car, his small stock portfolio, to immediately pay the delinquent property taxes and insurance, bringing the loan out of default. The company would then facilitate an expedited sale of the house, allowing me to reclaim my remaining equity. It was not the full amount I had lost, but it was a way out. I sat there in that cold, air-conditioned room, the lawyer's offer hanging in the air. It wasn't justice, not the kind you see in movies. It was a compromise, a salvage operation. They were offering me a way to escape the wreckage, to take back a portion of the life my son had sunk. It was not the home I had loved, but it was a key to a new door, a new life. And after a year of being locked in a prison of my own making, I knew I had to take it. The weeks that followed the mediation were a strange, hollow time. A for sale sign was staked into my front lawn, a public declaration of my private failure. The house was no longer a home. It was a property, an asset to be liquidated. I had to endure the quiet indignity of strangers walking through my life, opening my closets, commenting on the size of the kitchen, their voices echoing in the rooms where my children had grown up. Frank and Brenda were ghosts. They came and went to gather their most expensive possessions, their movements quick and silent, their eyes always avoiding mine. We were three strangers sharing a roof bound not by love, but by a legal settlement. The day we signed the final closing papers was the last time I saw my son. We sat on opposite sides of a long polished table in a title company's office, the air thick with the things we would never say. He looked smaller, diminished the smooth confidence he had always worn, now replaced by a weary resignation. When it was over, as we stood to leave, he turned to me and mumbled a quiet, "I'm sorry, Mom." I simply nodded. I did not say, "I forgive you." Forgiveness felt like a language I no longer spoke. Some betrayals are too deep for such simple words. They can only be acknowledged and then walked away from. With the check from the sale of my home, a sum that felt both enormous and insultingly small, I began the task of finding a new place to live. I was not looking for a house I had learned could be taken. I was looking for something simpler, something that was entirely, unshakably my own. I found it in a quiet, vibrant, senior living community called Willow Creek Gardens. My new home was a small, one-bedroom apartment with a balcony that looked out over a shared rose garden. It was not a fortress. It was a haven. I moved in on a sunny Tuesday morning. The apartment was empty, the walls a clean, blank slate. As I stood there, surrounded by the few boxes that contained the remnants of my life, a wave of profound and overwhelming loneliness washed over me. I had my freedom, yes. But I had lost my home, and I had lost my son. I had won the battle, but in the quiet of that empty room, it felt as though I had lost the war. And then my phone rang. It was my niece, Sarah, my late husband's sister's daughter. We had always been close in a quiet, distant way. She had heard through the tangled grapevine of family gossip what had happened. Her voice was not full of pity. It was a blaze of pure, righteous anger. "Aunt Maggie," she said, and her voice was fierce. "I just heard. I am so sorry." I tried to say that it was all right, that I was fine, but my own voice broke. He was always weak, and she was always greedy. Sarah continued her anger, a strange and wonderful comfort. "You deserved better. You deserved to be protected. This was not your fault." Hearing someone else say it, someone who loved me, someone who saw the truth without needing it, explained in a ledger, was the moment the real healing began. The shame I had been carrying, the quiet, persistent feeling that I had somehow failed, that I had been a fool, finally began to lift. Frank's mumbled apology had been for himself, an attempt to ease his own guilt. Sarah's anger was for me, and that, I realized, made all the difference in the world. We talked for over an hour. When I hung up, the empty apartment didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt peaceful. I looked at the boxes that held the small remaining pieces of my life. For the first time, unpacking didn't feel like a chore. It felt like an act of creation. I was not just settling into a new apartment. I was finally, after all this time, building a home that could never be foreclosed on. The months that followed were a quiet education in the art of rebuilding. My new apartment at Willow Creek Gardens slowly transformed from an empty box into a home. My old comfortable armchair fit perfectly by the window. I planted a small herb garden on the balcony, and the scent of rosemary and thyme would drift in on the afternoon breeze. I joined a book club. I played a surprisingly competitive game of bridge on Wednesday nights. I made friends. Women like me with stories etched into the lines on their faces who understood that companionship is not about filling a silence, but about sharing it comfortably. The pain of my son's betrayal did not disappear overnight. It became a quiet, distant ache, a scar that reminded me of a wound that had healed. But the shame was gone, completely washed away by the righteous anger of my niece and replaced by a new, powerful sense of purpose. I saw the faces of my new friends, heard their quiet worries about confusing bank statements, and sons who were helping them with their finances, and I knew what I had to do. I, Margaret Coleman, the retired school teacher, became a teacher again. I worked with the community director to start a small, informal workshop. We called it Know Your Worth. Once a month in the sunny community room, I would sit with a group of my fellow residents, and we would talk about money. I taught them how to read the fine print on a contract, how to set up secure passwords for their online banking, how to understand the difference between a gift and a loan. I took the most painful experience of my life and turned it into a lesson plan, a shield to protect other women from the mistakes I had made. Looking at the faces of the women in my workshop, I saw my own story reflected back at me. It's one of those classic grandma true stories, isn't it? The one about quiet trust and a loud betrayal. But what I've learned and what I now teach is that the most important grandma true stories aren't about the fall. They're about how you choose to get back up. It's why places like Granny Stories are so vital. They give a voice to our quiet battles and our hard-won wisdom, reminding us that we are not alone. My son thought my only value was in the equity of my house. But my true value was in the lessons I had learned. All these grandma true stories are not tales of loss. They are tales of survival, of reclaiming the final say in our own lives. I lost a house, but I found my voice. And I have decided to use it not to cry over what was broken, but to build something new and strong in its place. Thank you for listening to my story of loss and reclamation. If my journey has sparked a thought, a memory, or a feeling of recognition, I would be so honored if you would share your feelings or a piece of your own story in the comments below. The wisdom we share here is a fortress for all of us. If you know someone who needs a reminder of their own strength and value, please feel free to share this story. To continue building this fortress of shared wisdom, please consider subscribing to Granny Stories. Thank you for being a part of it.